really a commemoration of a very dark period in our history. But these remembrances are particularly significant in light of the current difficulties that we are all witnessing today. So the Holocaust Memorial is a time-honored tradition here at FIT. And the subject of today's talk is Sounds, Silences, and Echoes, Listening for World War II and the Holocaust from North Africa. So the topic will help us to recognize how the medium of music and concerts, recordings, books, and broadcasts were important means of communication and creativity, and how central these became to survival. As a community of creative people, this is really especially resonant here at FIT. We're very, very honored to have with us Dr. Christopher Silver, and that he has made the trip to be with us for this gathering. He's an accomplished scholar, and he is the Siegel Family Associate Professor in Jewish History and Culture at McGill University. So Dr. Silver is a celebrated scholar and the recipient of numerous awards and recognition, including that of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections. His book, Recording History, Jews, Muslims, and Music Across 20th Century North Africa, was awarded the Carl Brown Book Prize by the American Institute for Maghrib Studies and was recently translated into Arabic. He's the founder and the curator of Arabophone.com, which is a dedicated digital archive to preserve North Africa's Jewish musical past. So today's talk will bring attention to Jews in North Africa who, by our standards today, were people of color, and whose interwar Arabophone recording artists demonstrate a shared cultural identity between Jews and Arabs. And as we will hear shortly, Dr. Silver brings back the voice of these forgotten artists as he shares vintage recordings and, in a larger sense, demonstrates how lessons from history may suggest pathways forward during our own troubled times. So before I close, I want to acknowledge the dedication and the commitment of Professors Nudell and Professor Weinstein in making this event possible and keeping our tradition alive. So thank you all. I think this is going to be really an interesting presentation. I know you will learn new and different things. And now I'm going to turn this podium over to Professor Weinstein. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, our esteemed president of the Fashion Institute of Technology. Well, straight away, on behalf of the Holocaust Commemoration Committee, I want to thank Patrick Knisley, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, for his generosity year after year in making our public program possible. A more supportive dean this committee could not ask for. Because of his exceptional financial endorsement and because of streamlined events this year, we have not needed to appeal for additional monies from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as we usually do. Don't mistake that fact as any ideological turn away from that office. On the contrary, we enthusiastically support DEI on campus and say so loudly, in opposition to shocking federal governmental attacks on the principles and practices of DEI. Dr. Brown has already introduced Dr. Silver and spoken about his many achievements and distinctions. So, speaking for myself as a historian of the Holocaust, I'll take a moment to build instead on lessons that she invites us to learn. In examining the effects of fascism on a vulnerable minority of North African Jews during World War II, Dr. Silver inevitably turns our attention toward our own historical moment, with the anti-democratic, authoritarian, dictatorial, and frankly fascist actions of President Trump and his administration as they defy the Constitution and court orders by violating the civil rights of migrants who have been disappeared to a foreign prison without due process. Today, their targets are migrants. Tomorrow, the rest of us. Students are typically too busy to follow the daily news. As a student, I was. That said, it has never been more urgent for those of you who are citizens of this nation not only to know what's going on, but above all, to come together at every opportunity as part of a mass movement in defense of democracy against the growing tyranny in our own country, before something horrible and perhaps as consequential as the Holocaust can happen here. With that, I'll turn the microphone over to our esteemed guest, Dr. Christopher Silver.
Thank you for that moving set of introductions and words, and I want to thank President Brown and Professors Natalie Nudell and Andrew Weinstein as well for the very generous invitation to be with you here today, and also for all of you for coming out and making time for this event. With that, I'll just get started. On September 23rd, 1939, the Hebrew Hour, first launched on Radio Tunis 6 months earlier, aired a special program for Yom Kippur, the Jewish holiday centered on contemplation, repentance, and fasting in preparation for the closing of the heavenly gates. Unlike weeks previous, no music was broadcast that Saturday evening. Instead, the Tunisian Jewish journalist Felix Alouche addressed a potential audience which comprised not only his 95,000 co-religionists from Sousse to Sfax, but also curious Muslim compatriots who often tuned in. Knowing that his Jewish listeners would have just emerged from the ecstatic close of synagogue services as the broadcast went live, Alouche asked rhetorically whether there was much he could add, since the rabbis had no doubt covered the solemnity of the occasion in their sermons. World War II, which formally commenced with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, was now 3 weeks in the making. The previous November, Kristallnacht, the planned spasm of state violence directed by the SA and Hitler Youth, which targeted and burned to the ground hundreds of Jewish places of worship and thousands of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany, Austria, recently annexed to the Reich, and the newly occupied parts of Czechoslovakia, culminated with the removal of 30,000 Jewish men to a growing number of concentration camps. Forced to pay a debilitating indemnity for the very aggression directed against them, Jews were now confronted with the expropriation of their property through the process of forced Aryanization, of spoliation. For 4 years already, the Nuremberg laws, which further elaborated on and enshrined racial definitions of Germans, Aryans, and Jews, forbade marriage and sexual relations between the two groups, and disenfranchised in every sense so-called non-Germans. Indeed, at the moment when Alouche positioned himself before the microphone in the Radio Tunis studio, 6 years had passed since the Nazi rise to power and the Reichstag fire had led to the suspension of the German constitution and civil liberties. As the interwar period drew to a violent close, the quote-unquote social death of Jews, in Marion Kaplan's powerful turn of phrase, blended perilously with their legal exclusion, their physical removal to a sprawling concentration and slave labor camp system, and an evolving deportation system, and it was only getting worse. What then could Alouche possibly say on September 23rd, 1939, to assuage his Tunisian listeners, given the last half-decade plus, as the distance from the center of an ever-expanding catastrophe seemed to contract with every passing day? He offered supplications while attempting to stretch the temporal present to the past. He reminded, quote, "You have never stopped praying for peace, but now you are praying for victory," end quote. That prayed for victory was an allied one of France and Britain over the Axis powers of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. At stake were his people, the future. While the original transcript is torn at its edges, most of Alouche's powerful conclusion can be pieced together. The final line reads, quote, "After the judgment, forgiveness. We prostrate ourselves before God, sanctifying the triumph over evil," end quote. As war in Europe raged over the next several months, the Hebrew Hour continued to give voice to the emerging horrors while also striving to present a regular broadcast heavy on music. Increasingly, however, that sense of normalcy was difficult to maintain. On March 23rd, 1940, the evening of the Jewish holiday of Purim, commemorated by consecutive and alternating days of fasting, merrymaking, and feasting, Alush made clear the stakes of the here and now, which suddenly seemed not that distant from ancient Persia. He spoke the following words, quote, "In every generation, b'chol dor vador, an adversary arises, but justice always triumphs. Today, again, do France, England not rightly fight against the spirit of evil to render justice to the weak? Haman has been reborn as Hitler, but like the Persian minister, the Führer will also buckle under the weight of his own iniquity," end quote. He most likely concluded with the following pronouncement, although a series of crossouts in red pencil on this part of the radio text may give us pause. Quote, "Dear listeners, I would like for you during this Purim in the year 5700, this Purim 1940, to get everything you want, especially the defeat of the new Haman and the total victory of the Allies," end quote. In this version of the copy, Asher Mizrahi, the Jerusalem-born Jewish recording artist who long called Tunis home, followed Alush. Between 1929 and 1939, his popular music, carried on the Columbia, Hassan, and Decca labels, and all of it expressed in Arabic, could be heard from every concert stage and café concert from Tunis to Algiers. Like other musicians of his generation, Mizrahi was also a hazan, a cantor, and one of Mediterranean-wide repute. On March 23, 1940, for Radio Tunis, he chanted from the Book of Esther, the sacred text from which Alush's invocation of the Purim story derived. Then Bobby Bismuth, Mizrahi's colleague in the recording industry and on the pulpit, sang Mika Mocha, who is like you, God, the Hebrew liturgical poem written by the medieval Andalusian poet-philosopher Yehuda Halevi. On May 9, 1940, as France's Third Republic prepared for a German attack, the Hebrew hour was moved from Saturday to Monday evenings. The exigencies of an unfolding ground war and the ongoing war of the airwaves in which Mussolini's Italy, Franco-Spain, and Hitler's Germany fine-tuned Arabic language broadcast pandering to emerging nationalist sensibilities across North Africa contributed to the decision to free up a coveted time slot from a more narrowly focused Jewish program. On May 10, 1940, Nazi Germany began the invasion of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, dramatically enlarging its orbit, which of late also encompassed Denmark and soon Norway. France was next. It had been less than 3 months since Alush had yearned for the quote-unquote total victory of the Allies, but his hopes had been quickly dashed. By June 1940, the Hebrew hour had been expunged from the airwaves. Its removal occurred even before Vichy, the authoritarian and anti-Semitic regime, which replaced the Third Republic, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, promulgated its notorious anti-Jewish statutes across North and West Africa. In time, Alush, the host of the Hebrew Hour, would be sent to a labor camp outside of Tunis. For the entirety of the war, the Hebrew Hour would go silent. In my time with you today, we will dwell not only on the silences engendered by World War II and the Holocaust from North Africa, but also consider a set of sounds and echoes which reverberated across the Mediterranean during and after tragedy. There is, of course, deep significance and intrinsic value in amplifying the voices of historical actors like Alush on left or Mizrahi on right, who could be heard nearly everywhere through May 1940, and then almost nowhere for 3 harrowing years until May 1943, when Tunisia was liberated from Nazi Germany following 6 months of direct occupation. What animates this research and our conversation this afternoon is the pursuit of a better understanding of what North African Jews and Muslims knew of the unfolding war and its horrors, a deeper comprehension of the ways in which it impacted and enveloped communities and their relations, and the potential historiographical paths afforded by the surfacing of a dynamic soundscape. I'm here because the muting of Alush, Mizrahi, and others owes not only to the contemporaneous history already described in broad strokes, but also to its subsequent treatment or lack thereof by historians, which has rendered the North African context of the Second World War and the Holocaust beyond bounds, and its multivocal sounds beyond even consideration. As Alush pronounced his final words on the Hebrew hour in the year 5700, Some 500,000 Jews dwelled in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Much has been the case for time immemorial. Representing sizable demographics and urban centers, which you can see here in red, from Tangier to Tafilalt, and from Tlemcen to Tunis and across to Tripoli, Jews, mostly Arabophone, Arabic-speaking, had long been deeply embedded and productively entangled in a majority Muslim milieu. But the French conquest of Algiers in 1830, the annexation of Algeria to the French metropole in 1848, the 1870 Crémieux Decree, which legally transformed northern Algerian Jews into French citizens, the establishment of French protectorate regimes in Tunisia in 1881 and in Morocco in 1912, and the ongoing civilizing mission were driven and sustained by policies aimed at defining and dividing in order to rule. In general, the state endeavored to orient Jews away from Muslims and toward acculturation into France, or in the northern Moroccan case, into Spain, which also established a protectorate in the country in 1912. And we could say the same is true for Libya vis-a-vis the Italians. While Moroccan and Tunisian Jews were not naturalized en masse, did not become citizens of France, members of this non-Muslim minority were considered to be good, quote-unquote, candidates for assimilation, as Tunisian Jewish writer and intellectual Albert Memmi once framed it, even as their legal status remained that of colonial subjects, like almost all Muslims. French Jews thought in similar ways. Beginning in 1860, the Franco-Jewish educational system of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the AIU, pushed forward a program to modernize and make French their brethren and sisters in North Africa and across the Islamic world. The first AIU school opened its doors in Tétouan, Morocco in 1862. By the eve of World War I, the AIU could count some thousands of French-speaking graduates who occupied important and intermediate positions in the colonial economy. Now, most accounts of North African Jewish history trace a line along a path from emancipation to assimilation, a trope rather familiar within European Jewish historiography, by privileging sources visual in French over sources oral in Arabic. But a turn to sounds, both extraordinary and everyday, provides a dramatically different map to this historical and historiographical terrain. If the traditional approach supplies us with a history of elites and their pursuits, that which, quote, filled space in print but not in minds, end quote, in the words of C.L.R. James, it fails to account for a collective and class-conscientious Jewish and Jewish-Muslim past in which music, Arab music, was constitutive, central, and consequential. Arab music, in fact, was largely synonymous with Jews from the birth of the recording industry at the end of the 19th century and for more than 6 decades hence, despite a colonial power structure which attempted to orient them north to the other side of the Mediterranean rather than east and west. Celebrated instrumentalists and vocalists, stars and superstars, as well as impresarios and intermediaries, the robust trade in records and rise of radio meant that Arabophone Jewish artists provided North Africa with its soundtrack at moments of monumental change. El-Mutrabiyah, the orchestra founded in 1912 by the Algerian Jewish musical pioneer Edmond Natanyafil, brought the Andalusian repertoire, the multimodal suite music which traced its origins to Al-Andalus, Farad, the lost paradise that was medieval Islamic Spain, into the modern, into the recording studio, onto radio, and into concert halls that held thousands across Algeria and beyond. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, the orchestra expanded dramatically to include dozens of musicians, some of whom you see here. Nearly all of them were Jewish, and in fact, everyone in this photo who's wearing a tarbush or a sheshia, a hat, is Jewish. And at the center is a figure I'll speak about in just a second, who was a significant member of the orchestra and one of its most significant Muslim voices as well. So the major exception, as I just said, was Mahyeddin Bashtarzi, Yafil's Muslim disciple and successor who had taken over al-Mutrabiyah's direction with the death of his master in 1929. By his side was often Lili Al-Abbasi, the vocalist and violinist born Eli Moyal, who released hundreds of records between the two world wars. what I want to do now is stop talking for a second and show a little bit of film from 1933. This is from Nice. This is that orchestra that I was just mentioning. In white is Lili Al-Abbasi. So FIT students take note of his fit, his getup. And the person singing is Mahidin Bashtarzi, one of the most important Muslim voices of Al-Mutrabiya. I just wanted to give, well, there will be more music soon. I just wanted to give you a little taste of sort of where we are in the world, the moment in time, the fact that these orchestras were dealing very much with the technologies of the era, and that it was captured on film as well. And in fact, this film was shown as sort of a preview to a feature in theaters across the United States in 1933. Now, Al-Abbasi's popularity worked in many ways, but one of the things it could do was sometimes not only touch a nerve, but sometimes touch the wrong nerve. In 1937, for example, French security services in the neighboring protectorate of Morocco, so Al-Abbasi was from Algeria, discovered that this record here, Al-Abbasi's record, whose title translates to "O you who is going to the Sahara," appeared to render support for the figure at left, the Moroccan arch anti-colonialist Alal al-Fasi, who had recently been deported to that very location by the authorities. So Al-Abbasi comes out with a record about someone who has been lost to the Sahara at the very moment that the French exile a major anti-colonial figure to the Sahara itself. A similar nationalist program emerged with Salim Halali, born in eastern Algeria in 1920, and who came of professional age in Paris in the mid-1930s. The first record by the 18-year-old Jewish artist, made with his Muslim compatriots and collaborators Mohammed al-Kamal and Mohammed Gharbushan, was entitled Arjal Bladik, Return to Your Country. On the double-sided disc, Halali raised his voice to the Algerian people, encouraging the 100,000 or so Algerians who sojourned in metropolitan France for factory work to return to their own country in order to rebuild it. So here's one of the recordings we'll listen to. I don't know how loud the audio will be, and I don't know if I have much control here. But I just want to point out a few things with these records and then this recording in particular. What we're talking about with these records are heavy records made of shellac. They spun at 78 rotations per minute. They held about 3 minutes of music per side. So that's where we got at one point sort of the idea of the 3-minute song as sort of the perfection of music, popular or otherwise. And there's quite a lot of sort of materiality to the record itself outside of the audio, which we'll hear in a second. You can see a title in Arabic and then transliterated into French. You can see some composer and lyricist rights in parentheses just below that. You can see the artist and sometimes a signifier added to the artist. This is Ustad Halali, Professor Halali, as well as who accompanied them as well. So this is just, you're going to see why I haven't gone into sound engineering. This is just sort of like a snippet of a record from about a century ago, and hopefully the audio will cooperate, but we'll take a listen. And then I also tried to be fancy and put some scrolling lyrics that will appear almost perfectly with the music so that you can see what he's actually singing about. And again, the point here is to think about not only the voice, but the collaboration, Jews and Muslims, the language, and the message itself.
شركة أسوانات فاتي تقدم لكم الأستاذ هلالي. كنت أشيع وتحاب مخدم عميل الراس ولنا عربي مثلا في بلادنا بنيسان في بلادنا بنيسان رجع يا بلاد بلادك عطاش
On June 14th, 1940, Paris fell to German forces. Less than 10 days later, France signed an armistice with Germany that divided the country between the two entities. Nazi Germany now occupied northern France, including the capital. Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of the First World War and the military suppression of Morocco during the Reform, led the accommodationist French state, l'État français, in southern France from the resort town of Vichy. The Vichy government, which maintained control over Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, cooperated with the Nazi regime. On June 14, 1940, as the Germans entered Paris, Salim Halali was still there, as were El Kamel and Igar Bouchen. So too was the Tunisian Jewish recording artist, oudist, and composer Gaston Bshiri, who you can see at left. Captive as well were thousands of other North African Jews, not only in the so-called occupied zone, but on the southern side of the demarcation line as well. Like, for example, the singular Saoud el-Wahrani, you can see at right, another Algerian Jewish artist who remained in Marseille. Almost immediately following the surrender of France to Germany and the concomitant rise of Vichy, much of the music and many of the musicians once heard with regularity on radio, in theaters and cafes, and in public spaces in North Africa became ever more difficult to hear. On October 3rd, 1940, for example, the regime applied the first of the anti-Jewish statutes to unoccupied France, including Algeria. In addition to the promulgation of Jewish racial laws that hewed closely to those of Nazi Germany, Article 5 prohibited Jews from working in film, theater, and radio. On October 31st, 1940, the anti-Jewish statutes were extended to Morocco. In Tunisia, nearly identical restrictions were applied on November 30th, 1940. On October 13th, 1940, Radio Tunis, as well as Radio Algiers and Radio Morocco, were placed under the direct control of the French state's National Broadcast Authority, which was now aligned with German interests. With the promulgation of the anti-Jewish statutes in Algeria, the orchestra al-Mutrabiyya, which thrived in front of Jewish Muslim audiences for nearly 3 decades, and whose membership was Jewish almost to the one, was no longer permitted to appear on Radio Alger. The same was true for theaters and other public performance venues. On December 10th, 1940, an announcement thus appeared in the daily L'Echo d'Alger. Members of Al-Mutrabiyya were slated to gather the following day to discuss, quote-unquote, the reorganization of the society, in other words, its dismemberment. From that date until early 1943, just after the end of Vichy rule in Algeria, Al-Mutrabiyya disappeared from the radio, and so too from the pages of L'Echo d'Alger. Lili Al-Abbasi, an integral member of Al-Mutrabiyya and a prolific recording artist apart from it, had his records pulled from the air. His son recalled in his memoirs that his father referred to the period as the quote-unquote dark years. In Morocco, in accordance with the first anti-Jewish statute of October 31st, 1940, protectorate authorities dismissed Jews from Radio Morocco. On November 21st, 1940, the musical atmosphere further changed as cafes and cinemas were prohibited from playing records other than those containing, quote, classical music or music of patriotic inspiration, end quote, which nonetheless still had to be submitted to the censor. 1 year later, on August 5th, 1941, 2 additional anti-Jewish statutes were enacted. The first broadened the scope of discrimination. The second created the mechanism to carry out a census of Moroccan Jewry and registration of their property. Aryanization in Morocco had commenced. On October 7th, 1940, days after the implementation of the first anti-Jewish statute in France, Pétain's government abrogated the Camus decree in Algeria. In doing so, Vichy removed the French citizenship held by the majority of Algerian Jews since 1870. The move returned musicians like Lili Al-Abbasi and Salim Halali to a state of legal indigeneity at the same time that their Jewishness was transformed into a racial category holding the weight of law. For Algerian Jews living in France like Halali or Saoud el-Wahrani, the reversal of the Camus rendered them stateless at a moment when papers of state were determinant factors in survival. If in North Africa the careers of artists like Al-Abbasi were put on hold as a result of the October 1940 orders, in the metropole the lives of North African Jewish musicians were compromised. In German-occupied Paris, some North African Jews, including Hilali and the Tunisian Gaston Bshiri, attempted to survive the war by passing as Muslims. In doing so, Bshiri managed to perform publicly for a time after the fall of the Third Republic. The same was true for Hilali. Such a feat, of course, would have required the daring collaboration of Muslims. On September 27, 1940, for example, all Jews, citizens or not, were required to register with the French police. Special identity cards had to be carried on their person at all times. Months later, the Gestapo initiated a series of large-scale arrests and roundups. Foreign Jews, of which Hilali was now one, were especially vulnerable. Given his celebrity, the French press, for example, had anointed him the quote-unquote Oriental Tino Rossi before the war, all the more so. To be sure, Hilali was known to officials and functionaries in Vichy, North Africa, who communicated regularly with their counterparts in France. His name, for example, was invoked in confidential intelligence briefs. Following search and seizure efforts, his first recording was formally outlawed in Algeria and in Morocco, that nationalist recording we heard, in the midst of the war. In Paris, Hilali was on the radar of German officials as well, although his Jewishness was not always clear to them. The Germans, for example, attempted to enlist him in their radiophonic effort in the ongoing war of the airwaves. According to a contemporaneous journalist, Hilali, quote, refused, was arrested, roughed up by the Gestapo, and went into hiding, spending the occupation years in a state of terror, end quote. The walls were closing in on him. But somehow, Hilali, like a number of other Jews, was hidden. In this case, hidden at the Grand Mosque in Paris's Fifth, which you can see at left and which exists until this day, where the rector, Si Qadour ben Ghabrit, who we can see on the right, himself a music aficionado, issued him a certificate of conversion to Islam as a safeguard. At the same time that Hilali lived a suspended, imperiled life under Nazi rule, some of his Algerian Muslim compatriots in the music business continued on with their careers, including in service to the Germans. Mohamed El-Kamel, for example, went to work for Radio Paris Mondiale, which in 1940 had been transformed into a German propaganda outfit. In June 1942, El-Kamel recorded a half-dozen records for the Pate label. 1 month later, French police perpetrated the Veldiv roundup, interning thousands of Jews before sending most of them on to Auschwitz. Over the next year, the pace of arrest and deportation hastened. Among those caught in the expanding dragnet were Bea Hilali, Salim's sister, and her 6-month-old Claude. On August 17, 1943, Bea was arrested and interned at Drancy along with her baby. On September 2, 1943, the two were sent to Auschwitz and murdered. By the end of 1940, conditions in Algeria worsened for considerable swaths of the population, especially for recently denaturalized Jews. Due to the numerous clauses stipulations under the anti-Jewish statutes, large numbers of Jewish men and women had been dismissed from their jobs. Quotas likewise applied to the French schooling system, where most Jewish children were soon expelled. Food insecurity became a rampant problem. As Vichy officials implemented a rationing system, the marché noir, the black market economy, was forged. In his memoir, the Algerian Jewish pianist Maurice Medioni, who died last year at the age of 95 and was himself the nephew of the Marseille Trab Saoud al-Wahrani, recalled that the war years were, quote-unquote, extremely difficult in his native Oran. Alongside the scarcity and the vitriolic anti-Semitism, El-Madioni's older military-age brother was sent to the Vichy concentration camp of Bedo, one of the many labor and internment sites that dotted the North African landscape, in which you can see here. On November 8th, 1942, 100,000 American and British troops stormed the shores of Morocco and Algeria. 3 days later, Operation Torch, which ultimately aimed to overrun Morocco through Tunisia in order to drive Axis forces out of Libya and Egypt, while also setting the stage for an Anglo-American incursion into Europe, came to an end with the surrender of the Vichy regime in North Africa. The Allied victory, however, prompted a German takeover of the other half of France and the direct occupation of Tunisia. This meant more deportations, including of the Algerian musician Saoud al-Wahrani to Sobibor. In May 1943, the war took another turn. The Allies pushed German and Italian forces out of Tunisia, and from there initiated the Italian campaign from Sicily. The hardships and deprivations of the war did not immediately abate in the aftermath of Operation Torch. Many Vichy officials, for instance, maintained their positions in the new French administration, providing a direct continuity between the war years and those that followed. Anti-Jewish legislation, for that matter, was repealed neither in Morocco nor Algeria until March 14th, 1943. In Algeria, the reinstatement of the Camus Decree would be delayed until October 1943. In other words, the returning of French citizenship to Jews was hardly a fait accompli after the war. In the meantime, food shortages persisted across North Africa. By 1943, the cost of staples had risen to 10 times their pre-war prices. Cigarettes, candy, simple pleasures before the onset of Vichy rule were still all but impossible to procure outside of the black market, with one notable exception: the Americans. The American forces of visible and physical presence after November 1942 doled out such indulgences and more. For North African Jews, the Americans who vanquished Vichy and would do the same with the Germans in Tunisia came to represent liberation from an existential threat, saviors whose intervention was nothing short of divine. This sentiment was immediately rendered into multiple musical idioms. Some utilized traditional Jewish liturgical forms like the Purim Megillah or the Passover Haggadah. Others employed the form of the Qasida, the strophic song text associated to the Andalusian repertoire. In Tunisia, the Qina, a type of ballad, was used for laments. Popular genres prevailed too. While some of this music faded from memory in the decades after the war, not all did. Among those that are still sung is this song, Khamuz Jana, The Allies Have Come to Us, published by a certain Simon de Yacoub Cohen in Tunis sometime in 1943 or 1944. Cohen's Khamuz Jana begins with the arrival of the Germans in Tunisia. It's written in Judeo-Arabic, and I can talk about that at the Q&A afterwards. Among the first transgressions against the Jewish community, the song calls attention to as a sonic one, namely, quote-unquote, the requisition of our radios. Cohen then proceeds to enumerate the other offenses, the roundups, the establishment of Jewish councils, and the use of anti-Semitic vitriol. But the refrain serves as constant reminder of their salvation. Quote, the Allies have come to us and removed the German oppression, end quote. In Khamuz Jana, the Americans enter like a bride, kif la'arusa, and what is carried along with them does indeed resemble a dowry. And here I'm quoting from the lyrics, and I'll get to this in just a second. They brought flour, delicious chocolates they distributed to us, and gave us candy. The Allies came to us, money was exchanged, a hallowed time, the banks were full. Soap and sugar, chewing gum and cigarettes, fresh milk are Americans, end quote. Finally, the song ends with praise of the Allied leaders, which you can see here sort of blurry in French transliteration of an Arabic rendered in Hebrew characters, the Judeo-Arabic. Roosevelt, light of our eyes, de Gaulle and Stalin, and Churchill, the compassionate, protect them, our Lord. Khamuz Jana circulated widely in post-war Tunisia. In his memoirs, the Tunisian Jewish recording artist Raoul Journo recalled performing it constantly following liberation. Whenever he sang it, he remembered it, quote, rained dollars, end quote. One final song by an Algerian Jewish recording artist deserves mention, Lili Boniche's Marché Noir, The Black Market, recorded in 1947. Unlike Khamuz Jana, Boniche's Marché Noir was intended for a much wider North African audience, and in this way captures a shared Jewish-Muslim feeling toward the Americans and toward the warriors that preceded their entry. Boniche, like his contemporary Halali, was on the path to stardom before the war broke out. By 1938, he was heralded as El-Mutrabiya's new star in the orchestra's own promotional materials. Marché Noir was part of his comeback. The song begins with piano and droning violin before Boniche arrives at his prolonged lament in Arabic. Oh, the good old days, I wonder if they will return. Their lightness became darkness. Time lost its meaning, end quote. The young Algerian Jew, sidelined under Vichy and only 25 years old at the time of the recording, was invoking the pre-war moment. More than 3 minutes into the song and toward the very end of the first side of the record, Boniche reaches the mostly French language refrain about the black market and how the layaway system operated. In Arabic, Boniche sings of quotidian difficulties wherein everyone's heart is broken. Throughout, he inserts the English learned from American soldiers into his verses. He ends on a note of hope mixed in French and Arabic, engendered by the American arrival of the Americans. Quote, Now that goods are available, the situation is settled, thank God. We can tell our sons and daughters the story of the black market, end quote. I have one more song here and time is short, so we're gonna skip this audio, but I can make it available to you afterwards. Do you want it? Okay. I have like a very tepid, we want the audio, so I guess I'll do it. Okay. The people have spoken. We'll take a listen. It's about 2 minutes. And again, this is my editing, so forgive it.
جديد باسيفيك الشاب ليلي بونيك وربعته يا حسرة على دوك الأيام يا حسرة على دوك الأيام يا تراهم يعودوا دوهم رجع الظلام والزمان ده مقصود ومقصود
This is my fade out, so there's a little bit more left.
دوكي السلعة راهي جات غاسة دي والدعوة طرات نحكي والولاد والبنات سيت استوار في مارشي نوار اي 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 مارشي نوار اي 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 نوكي يوم ما
I'm almost done. Following Operation Torch in November 1942 and the liberation of Tunisia in May 1943, prominent Jewish musicians returned to the North African stage and appeared once again on radio, but overall their numbers were much diminished. El Mutarbiya, for example, was replaced by an all-Muslim ensemble on Radio Algeria in 1940, and Yafil and Bashtarzi's former orchestra just barely survived the war as an institution. After 3 decades of making music, it would tour Algeria one final time in 1943. To be sure, tastes had changed, but the legal silencing of the Jewish musicians had not helped much either. In France and then beyond, a number of prominent Jewish musicians would not survive the war. With each of their deaths, a world of Arab music passed down from master to disciple went silent. Sometime in early 1942, for example, Gaston Bshiri, the Tunisian Jewish recording artist, oudist, composer, and teacher, was arrested by the Gestapo. On April 8th, 1942, he met his end in Auschwitz. I've already mentioned Saoud al-Wahrani and his deportation to Sobibor. The reverberations of these deaths were felt well beyond the confines of continental Europe. Everywhere confusion abounded. Press accounts in 1944, for example, presumed Salim Hilali, trapped in Paris since 1940 and sheltered by the Grand Mosque thereafter, presumed him to be dead. But somehow Hilali survived, an Algerian Jewish Holocaust survivor. And after World War II, he rode a wave of immense popularity. In part, it was derived from the staggering number of records he released beginning again in 1945. Almost all of that initial output had one thing in common. The Tunisian Jewish composer Gaston Bshiri was credited as either the composer, the lyricist, or both, and you can see that sort of in blurred green here. We'll take a listen. This is only 30 seconds, and then we'll conclude.
سلم هلالي الحبيب مهدي العمر واللي يطلب تنزلي هو عمري هو قصري يا عيني عين عليه الحبيب انا مهدي العمر واللي يطلب كله ليه واللي يطلب كله ليه واللي يطلب كله ليه.
There's a lot to say about that song, including its title, I Belong to You, and where he sings about a male figure who has been lost. One of the questions I have in the course of this research is, what exactly was their relationship? Did Helali and Bshiri know one another in Paris? If so, how and when did Bshiri transmit his music to his co-religionist from Algeria? Whether the post-war writing credit on this record constituted mere coincidence or an act of homage on Helali's part is unclear. Regardless, Helali had managed to amplify the voice of a fellow Arabophone North African Jewish musician silenced by World War II and the Holocaust. It's in listening for said voices, sounds, silences, and echoes that we are reminded of how history is rendered in many keys. Thank you. So I did that thing that professors often do, which is take you right to the edge as you're angling for the door. And I know there's supposed to be some Q&A.